My name is Chris, though you might recognize my voice from another channel called Stoehovve, where I do various tutorials for Fantasy Grounds Unity. In collaboration with Smiteworks, I'm going to create a spellcaster-based character using the new character creation wizard and explain how the new character wizard works. As many of you might know, the character wizard is a promise that was fulfilled not long after the release of Fantasy Grounds Unity. Since then, it has undergone a few more revisions and has almost been completely reworked to be far more flexible than when it was initially released. As part of the new changes, the overall flow of creating a character has changed slightly and brings forward some of the new rules in relation to character creation within 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. In this video, I will be using the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rule set to create a level 1 sorcerer class character, using a combination of all the supplements that I have available to me to highlight all of the sections that you will need to pay attention to while creating that character. Much of this video is going to be very similar to that of the character creation video I did for the melee/ranged based character, but this is being done intentionally to reduce the need for someone to have to watch both of those videos and only focus on the one that makes sense for them. While it is still possible to create a character manually, I do highly recommend making use of this character wizard because it's going to guide you through the whole character creation process. I find it far more efficient to use this panel, which I'll be displaying here in a moment, to create characters because all of the tools you need are accessible in that one panel. The character wizard is accessible from the player grouping here. So if you look here, it's going to be under this characters window. Right here in the upper left portion of this character selection screen, you click on that and it's going to open the character wizard. As you can see, this panel is very much organized to allow you to flow through the various states of the character creation process in the order that you're expected to do it. It doesn't mean you have to do it in this order, but it is highly recommended that you do make use of this particular order. Before I get into creating that character, however, you're going to want to make sure that you have all of your modules that you need to have in place loaded. So if I go here, you can see that I have roughly 2 pages of modules loaded. And that is to ensure that as I go through this character creation process, you can see what it's going to look like if your Dungeon Master has quite a few options available to you. But the reason why you want those modules loaded before you open up the character wizard is because at the time that the character wizard opens, that's when it's going to collate all of that information that it's going to use from those supplements in order to allow you to go through and create your character. The other thing that I want to point out here is that these are the tabs that you're going to want to focus on in relation to your overall flow. As you progress, additional tabs are going to appear here, but each of the important tabs are going to have these indicators on them, specifically this check mark, this exclamation mark, and this X indicator. These are cues that you're going to want to pay attention to know that something still has to be done in those tabs before you can commit or save the character to the Dungeon Master system and have Fantasy Grounds Unity create your character sheet for you when you do that. Additionally, as you progress within a given panel, there's going to be some additional hints that pop up here down at the bottom of the character wizard screen in this sort of long bar that you see at the bottom. It's going to explain exactly what you have to do or still have pending to do within that particular panel. And it's going to be panel specific. So if it's anything specific to the race, it might be related to your racial modifiers that you haven't yet selected or a given language or anything like that. Whereas if it's related to your class, it might be elements that are specific to that class that still have a quote-unquote pending state associated with them. The very first panel that you see is going to be your stats panel. And before you even sit down and actually go through this character creation process using these stats, there are 3 questions you really should ask your Dungeon Master so that they can answer them for you. The first is, as a player, how are you going to generate your ability scores? Is it going to be through the standard array? Is it going to be through a point buy system? Or are you going to be able to roll for your stats? The manual option that you see here is specific to if the Dungeon Master is allowing you to roll the dice locally and then you enter those values in as you go, or, and this is my recommendation, you've saved those values because something went wrong in the combat tracker and you need to manually re-enter them. The second question you're going to want to ask your Dungeon Master is, are they allowing for custom races? And that means that are they allowing for the custom lineage race that was introduced by Tasha's Cauldron of Everything? A second part to that question would be, if they are not allowing for custom lineage usage, are they allowing for the alternative abilities that Tasha's Cauldron of Everything has introduced around the abilities of what you can do for your races and setting them up. The last question is only going to be pertinent at this particular stage if you're creating a character of level 4 or higher. And that is going to be, is the Dungeon Master allowing for feats within their campaign? Once you have answers to all of those questions, the next thing you're going to want to do is to use the commonly recommended approach in going through and creating your character. And that approach is to determine what your stats are for your ability scores, then move on to choosing your race, then your class, and then your background. After that, you can then go in and fill in your inventory and or your spells if you happen to have those, and then finally take a look at some feats. And depending on the answer to the first question, you might need to adjust how your ability scores have been determined. The Character Wizard does support all of the options that the 5th edition rule set does, and as I said, it's the point-buy system, the standard array, or the dice roll method. As a Dungeon Master for my campaigns, I will generally allow the following rule for a player when it comes to their character creation process. They can essentially roll 3 times total, but if they do not like the values of the rolled stats in their first roll and decide to roll again, they have to accept the values of that new roll unless they want to go ahead and roll their third time. I have used other methods associated with going through and creating character stats, but I have found this is going to be the fairest approach in relation to the games that I run, because it forces a player to think about their stats and what they might have in mind for their character. If they have chosen to roll a new set of stats because they had one bad value and it was just not up to their standards, they might have to weigh the risks against the possible gains, much like they would during a given campaign. So it puts them right in the right frame of mind on day 0. For our demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and use the dice roll option, and that is because it's going to allow me to demonstrate something else. Specifically, as soon as you choose that, it's going to go ahead and roll the 6 stats for you. It uses the roll 4d6 dice option and then drop the lowest of that particular roll. Now, unfortunately, I have a 6 here, but I also have an 18. Now I have to make that choice of, do I take the risk of not getting another higher stat, or do I want to find a stat that I can put this in and then role play that situation if I have to use that particular stats? In this particular case, I'm going to start suffering penalties. That has a little bit of risk when you do that. As an additional part of this particular demonstration, I'm actually going to re-roll this. And why I want to do that is because when you go through and re-roll, you don't have to select this again. All you have to do is click this re-roll button. And I got much better stats, even though I didn't get an 18 or 17 in this particular case either. But I have a much higher average of stats overall because they're all 12 or higher with the exception of this 1-9. But keep in mind, I haven't selected a race yet. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the Races tab so that we can now see what happens when we go through and select that. The Races panel should be the next panel that you visit, as it will allow you to determine the race of your character through the use of one of these pre-generated races or through the use of this custom lineage option that became available within Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. As you can see, I have quite a few races here, and that is because I've intentionally gone ahead and loaded every module that I have that provides one so that you can see how full this selection screen can get, and to demonstrate something else. This character wizard now has the ability to be adjustable, so you can actually increase and decrease its size. Now, it goes both ways, and you can do so using the control and the shift or alt key as well at the same time. So all of the resizing options that Fantasy Ground provides you normally now work on the character wizard. Before, it used to be statically sized. As I go through and choose a race, you can see that this left menu makes an adjustment. And you will also see that there is a new option down here to indicate that there's still something that is pending. And that is because I still have to go through and select my racial modifier. But it is possible to go back and make an adjustment to a race. So let's say that you went through and you selected the Firbolg, but you decided that you didn't want to take it and you wanted to go, say, for a Goblin. You can still go through and make that adjustment. The only time it can be a problem is if you've gone ahead and selected the custom lineage, selected all of the elements associated with the custom lineage, and then you changed your mind and you went back to a normal race. That can sometimes screw up the character wizard. As a result, I highly recommend that you write down the raw values of these stats just in case that you have to go and actually close out the character wizard because of that. The other time where it becomes a bit of a problem is if you've gone ahead and you've committed your character to the point where it's now created the character sheet. After that, you're essentially going to have to go create a new character in order to simplify the process of fixing that in relation to a race selection. If, however, you have a question of any of these races, you can use this dragon icon here, or whatever icon happens to be there for the theme that is loaded, to pull up the information sheet. And if you've already selected a race, you can do that from here. This just gives you all of the information that you're going to need right here at your fingertips in relation to race selection. I want to point out that I'm not going to be covering the custom lineage selection in this particular video, and I will be doing that in another video. So don't worry about that. It is going to be demonstrated, just not in this video. As I am creating a sorcerer, in this case, I'm actually going to select the Aasimar. And specifically, I'm going to select this subrace called the Protector Aasimar. And regardless as to whether you select a subrace or are prompted to select a subrace or not, you're eventually going to have to select your racial modifiers. And the default option here actually buries 2 sets of options in relation to this particular setting. What it does is it allows you to simply use the default that is assigned by the race, and that is going to be configured based on the ability score increase here that you will find in the information sheet, as well as through the subrace. The other option is if you happen to have Tasha's Cauldron of Everything loaded and the Dungeon Master is allowing it, you have the ability to adjust the stat that you have your +2 or your +1 bonus in. So that is where both of those particular options are buried. But there is a quote-unquote third option, even though it's labeled option 2. And that is to simply go through and select 3 different ability scores and increment each of them by 1. I honestly can't recall what introduces that, but this option isn't necessarily supposed to be there every single time. As you might have noticed, when I selected this default option, 2 additional panels popped in here, and that allows me to make these adjustments. If I go with option 2, however, only 1 option here pops up, but I have the ability to choose 3 different stats in that. I myself am simply going to go with the default option just to simplify this particular process, and because the Aasimar's default setting adjusts Charisma and Wisdom, which are the 2 stats that I want to focus on in relation to my Sorcerer. Now, my Charisma is not necessarily up to snuff, meaning that it is only 11, and that's because it brought it up from a 9 using this +2 bonus. I'm going to go back and make an adjustment to that by moving these particular stats here after the fact. Now, I currently have this set for manual entry. Because of that, I don't appear to have the ability to shift these stats around, which kind of sucks because I really don't want to change this. And I'm not sure why that's an option, why that's come into play, because it was here during the melee option when I had to go through and manually enter these values into place. Oh well, I guess I'm just going to re-roll it so that I get that ability back. I'll use these. To move these around, I am simply going to go ahead and move my Charisma to there. I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to do that. So I'm going to work with a very low con and a potentially low initiative. Actually, I'm going to flip those 2. That's intelligence, not initiative, by the way. I suppose it makes sense to a certain degree that with manual entry, you don't need to do this because you could just simply re-enter the value as you see it. So, oops, oh well. As you can see, I now have a checkmark in my stats, which was there already, and I have a checkmark in the race tab. So I don't need to worry about these 2 panels anymore. I am now going to move on to the class selection panel. As we can see on this tab, there are a limited number of classes available, even with the number of modules that I have loaded. And this is because the official class listing has not really grown much. In fact, only 1 new class has really been added to 5th edition, and that was the Artificer class. The information icons and the buttons work very much the way they did in the Races panel, in that you can click on the dragon icon and pop open the information sheet associated with that particular class. Or you can just simply select a class. Clicking on that button selects that particular class, and you can gain access to the information icon here. You will also notice that it has made an adjustment to this side of the panel so that you can actually go through and select your proficiencies, as well as a specialization. As you go through and select your proficiencies, you don't need to worry about whether you're going to unintentionally select a particular proficiency that is duplicated by the background. And that is because the system has been updated to allow you to go through and select what you want, and then once you've selected your background, if you've now got a duplicate, you can come back to the Classes tab and make an adjustment to it. It will no longer double up those proficiencies. Because this is also the Sorcerer class, I'm also going to be prompted for my class specialization because Sorcerers choose theirs at level 1. In this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and choose the Divine Soul one, just to demonstrate what that looks like as part of the selection process. Now, before we move on to the backgrounds panel though, I want to point out that unlike the melee ranged class characters that we created in the previous video, where both the class and the background have to be added before new options appear at the top of the button list, in this case you only have to select the class to gain access to the spells listing here. And the feats appears, I'm pretty certain, after you've gone through and selected a race and potentially your class. But this feats button doesn't necessarily always appear when you select your race. It will start to appear though when other buttons begin to appear. However, because we are going through and selecting a particular class that deals with spells, this is when this particular spell tab will now pop up. A background is used by your character to more or less fill in their history a little bit and give you a starting point for adding more information around their history. It's used to explain where your character came from, what they did prior to becoming an adventurer, and explains how you should actually roleplay your character based on their ideals, their flaws, and their bonds. For the purposes of this character wizard, all you're going to have to worry about at this point is the choice of your background, as well as deal with any language and tool selections and other forms of equipment selections that your background is going to trigger for you. In this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and choose the Sage background because that's going to trigger something that I want to point out in relation to the class selection panel. Additionally to that, our inventory panel has now popped up. Before I leave this background panel though, I want to go ahead and just choose a language here. So I'm playing an ASMR, so the Abyssal language might be appropriate, and maybe an Elvish language. Perfect, okay. Now I'm going to go back and deal with this particular issue that now has come up in relation to our classes panel. When I had selected the classes, I had intentionally selected the Arcana skill because I knew the background I was going to choose was going to also provide that. And I did that intentionally to show you what happens when you have a duplicate. In this particular case, it deselected the Arcana selection here because our background provides it implicitly. You don't have to select it. Now what I'm going to do is choose a different one. And in this case, I'm going to just simply choose Religion. Now, as I said earlier, once you have selected both the class and the background, your inventory panel is going to appear. And this is because your equipment is generally provided by your class and your background, though it can sometimes also come from your character race selection as well. Some of these selections are going to explode out into other equipment. For example, these packs here contain a number of items within them, so that when your character sheet is actually created, you won't have an explorer's pack in your inventory, but what you will have is an actual listing of all of these individual items that are here, including a backpack. Hence why I chose the term exploded, because generally this is classified as a quote-unquote kit. Much like the other panels, you're going to want to go through and select the various options that you have here. And in this particular case, I want to point out something that is going to be unique to spellcasters, and that is their arcane focus selection or their component pouch. As a spellcaster, you have two main options for casting spells when it comes to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. For the most part, you can use a spell focus, and this is specifically around casting spells that don't require any form of material component that has a cost associated with it. If you were casting a spell that had a material component that had that cost value, you would use that in conjunction with your spell focus to actually complete the casting of that spell. And that is primarily because your focus is substituted into place for all other components that come into play or are required for that particular spell that don't have a cost associated with them. Your other option is simply to make use of spell components right from the get-go, and in order to do that, you would have to have a component pouch to be able to contain those spell components. And that is the other method that you can use to cast those spells, because you would be carrying around all of the required components that you need to cast it within this component pouch. The problem is, when you start utilizing components, you will be spending an awful lot of coin trying to make sure that you keep that particular component pouch full, specifically of all of the components that you would use for the various spells that you typically cast. My recommendation, if you're just starting out with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition or are starting at a really low level, is to choose a focus first, because you can switch to utilizing a component pouch later on as you have the coin to be able to consistently keep that pouch filled. Now in our example, I'm just going to simply select the crystal here. However, this isn't the only way that you could go through and fill out your equipment. You have the choice of utilizing this starter equipment window, which is the panel that we can see now where we have each of these items presented for us, including the 2 daggers that we're implicitly acquiring. Or you can go here and individually purchase the equipment. But I want to caution you on something. As soon as you pop open this purchasing window, it is going to be preferred over top of your starting equipment selection. So even though you might have made the selection here, as soon as you switch to here, you've essentially quote unquote erased what Fantasy Grounds is going to see that you have thus chosen. All of your gear, all of your weapons, and all of your armor can be selected from this list. And it's going to show you a combined list of every single option that is available. And I generally recommend using this particular purchasing requirement if you're creating a higher level character. If you're simply starting out, I highly recommend you simply start out with your starting equipment. Now, I'm going to go ahead and reset this and re-choose all of the items here so that I can guarantee that this is the selection that I am going to get. Once again, as a spellcaster, you're going to start off with a number of spells that you'll be able to make use of, and it's going to be different depending on the kind of class that you have selected. And this is going to be made up of 2 types of spells. Specifically, your first category is going to be cantrips, and these are going to be spells that you'll be able to cast over and over and over again without having to worry about utilizing a spell slot or using up any form of material component. Although there are some cantrips, I believe, that do make use of a component, but they're generally spells that are so easy to cast, you can do it without thinking. That's essentially what it is. The second type are your leveled spells, which are spells that are of a given level, and for a sorcerer, this would be any spell that is level 1 through to level 9. Now, that doesn't mean that it is equal to your character level. What you will find is that there is a ratio associated with your class as to when you'll unlock 2nd level spell slots, 3rd level spell slots, 4th level spell slots, and so on. It is not equal to you being level 1, level 2, level 3, or level 4. Near the top of your spell selection screen, you will see a spell list option here that lists slots levels 1 equaling 2. That means that you have 2 level 1 spell slots at this particular level. This also means that you will be able to cast 2 level 1 spells throughout the course of a day before your character is going to be required to execute a long rest in order to regain the ability to cast 2 additional level 1 spells. Other spellcaster classes are going to have a different number of spell slots or uses before they will be required to complete a long rest in order to regain those spent spell slots. Just below this, there are 2 selection boxes here, and there will be more if you're creating a higher level character. In this particular case, we have cantrips and level 1 spells. And when I flip between the 2 of them, you'll see that the list here changes. You will also see that we actually have class selection listings down here now, and that is because there are some capabilities where a particular character can choose a spell from another class. Doesn't always happen in this particular case for a sorcerer, but that option is now officially supported within the character wizard creation process. By default, however, your chosen class will be the button that is selected here, and the listing associated with that will be all of the spells that your character can actually cast as part of that class. To simply add a cantrip or a spell, you want to make sure that your cantrip is selected, your class is selected, and then you can just simply click on this green arrow here to add that particular spell to your list. You can no longer drag and drop a spell down into this particular grouping. So in this case, for example, I will go ahead and choose a couple of cantrips, and you will see that that cantrip disappears from this list. That way you can't accidentally select a duplicate, if you will. And there we go. Now, there is something that I want to point out here. It will allow you to go over that cantrip selection screen or option there. Ideally, you shouldn't do that, but I don't know why the constraint of being able to do this doesn't lock it so that you can't select that. In any event, if you accidentally select too many or you've chosen to change one out, you can add it and then you can go back and delete the one that you didn't want by double clicking on this particular button here. The first click selects the spell to confirm for deletion, and then the second one actually does the confirmation. Now let's do the same thing with my level 1 spells. And there we go. Now I will point out, clerics are a spellcasting class that have the ability to know the existence of all of the spells that they can go ahead and cast. It's their prepared spells that restricts the spells that they actually have the ability to cast for that given day. So I can understand why the ability to continue adding spells is here, because maybe you want to add all of these spells to your character's action sheet prior to you using your character. Well, as a cleric, you can do that, and then all you have to do from that point forward is just select the ones that you have prepared. However, we have now completed our spell selection here, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the final tab that we have. The Feats tab, while available, will not always have a selectable feat that you can choose from. And this is because feats are granted under very specific conditions, be they while you're leveling up to certain points in your character, for example level 4 and gaining the ability to improve an ability score, or whether you're going through and creating a custom lineage, because that creation process for the custom lineage allows you to choose a feat. Generally though, unless a DM is running a module that provides a custom adjustment to the feats rule, you won't see feats listed here at level 1, but if you're creating a higher level character, you will. However, the character wizard prompts you to look here just as a precaution, because who knows, maybe the rules will change in the future to allow you to choose a feat at a specific level, or maybe there's a new race that introduces the option to choose a feat before you create your character. There are two last things that you're going to want to do in order to create your character's character sheet. The first is you're going to want to pre-populate a name here, and I'm going to go with Omni, or Ami, simply because I have the inability to create names, so I always have to go to a random generator to do that, and I rolled that when I was setting up the script. Now that I have a name there, I can go ahead and actually commit my character, and what this does is it saves the actual character into a character sheet and closes out the character wizard. So I'm going to click that, and you can see here that we now have a character sheet. We have all of our skills that we have selected. We have all of the abilities associated with the class, including optional capabilities here. We have all of our inventory items, and we have some of our actions here that are preset, including all of the spells that we went through and selected. There is some additional work that is required in order to go through and complete the setup. The first is that you're going to want to work with the Dungeon Master to get a portrait and a token put into place, whether it's one that they're going to provide for you or one that you're going to create using some form of software to do so, or an online service to be able to do so. You can create your portrait and then give that to the Dungeon Master, and then they can add it to your character, and you can do the same thing with a token. Now, there are a large number of token packs that already exist, so it's possible that your Dungeon Master already has something in place for a character that might represent your class and or your race, and they can just simply drop that into place. But you yourself can't select that. It has to come from the Dungeon Master system. You will also want to go to your Notes tab here, and then coordinate with the background here associated with your character. So in this case, I am a sage. I'm going to expand this out here. And what you're going to want to do is make use of these tables down here to go through and select a personality, create an ideal, a bond, and a flaw. And you can do that by using these tables directly for inspiration, pick and choose an item that you wish to use, or randomly roll for your character and drag and drop that particular item into place. Another thing that you're going to want to do is go to your race and look for your age and size information sheets here, because it's going to indicate to you a safe-ish range that you can choose for your age, height, and weight within the notes field here in order to give your character some appearance-related data in order to allow you to set a framework that you can use to describe your character to others. The next thing you will want to look at is your character's alignment, because that is going to indicate to yourself and to the Dungeon Master whether your character is good or evil, or somewhere in the middle. A deity might also come into play, because as a sorcerer, you're casting spells that are being granted to you, potentially by Mithra, but also potentially by another deity. It entirely depends on what world your Dungeon Master is running your campaign in, and whether they've created their own deities that you can select from, or whether they're going to use ones that already exist. It's entirely up to the Dungeon Master. They will have the information that you will need in order to figure out which deity that you want to be able to make use of. Another thing that you're going to want to do is take a look at the Abilities tab here and see if there's anything under the features or traits that you need to go through and add to your character's action sheet. For example, Healing Hands here might be something that you need to add here, because by default, the only thing that is here is Light, and that is a innate spell. This capability is a racial trait that is provided by the Aasimar race. So you'll want to look at how to go through and set this up, or use an extension that already has these created for you, and then you just drop them into place. I have videos up on my channel that actually will run you through the process of going through and setting up all of your class features that are actionable in your action sheet. So go ahead and take a look at that channel. I've already got a link in the description below. And just simply look for the class that you have chosen, and it will walk you through levels 1 through all the way to level 20. However, none of those videos will actually cover much in the way of the racial traits. So if you look at a couple of examples from those videos, you may be able to figure out how to deal with those here. The new character wizard is a great addition to Fantasy Grounds Unity, and it provides a nice, clean, guided approach to character creation, lowering the bar to entry to newer players. It takes very little time to go ahead and create a character if you happen to already be familiar with the various options, but it also provides everything at your fingertips while you're creating your character, so there's far less bouncing around required in order to complete a character creation. I want to thank you for watching this video, both on behalf of Smiteworks and myself. I also want to thank Smiteworks for providing me the opportunity to present this information on their channel, and I look forward to continuing with our collaboration. Please click on the like button if you found the information in this video useful to helping you learn how to use Fantasy Grounds Unity, and consider subscribing to the Smiteworks Fantasy Grounds YouTube channel to keep up to date with new content as it is released. If you have any questions or comments about this video, feel free to post them in the comment section of the video below for others to see and contribute to the discussion.